There's nothing the matter with his mind. He just does things in his own way, in his own time. I don't want him to grow up to be dumb like me, Meg had said. Oh, my darling, you're not dumb, her father answered. You're like Charles Wallace. Your development has to go at its own pace. It just doesn't happen to be the usual pace. How do you know? Meg had demanded. How do you know I'm not dumb? Isn't it just because you love me? I love you, but that's not what tells me. Mother, I've given you a number of tests, you know? Yes, that was true. Meg had realized that some of the games her parents played with her were tests of some kind, and that there had been more for her and Charles Wallace than for the twins. IQ tests, you mean? Yeah, some of them. Is my IQ okay? More than okay. What is it? That I'm not going to tell you. But it assures me that both you and Charles Wallace will be able to do pretty much whatever you like when you grow up to yourselves. You just wait till Charles Wallace starts to talk. You'll see. How right he had been about that. Though he himself had left before Charles Wallace began to speak, suddenly, with none of the usual baby preliminaries, using entire sentences, how proud he would have been. You'd better check the milk, Charles Wallace said to Meg now, his diction clear and clearer than that of most 5-year-olds. You know, you don't like it when it gets skin on top. You put in more than twice enough milk, Meg peered into the saucepan. Charles Wallace nodded serenely. I thought Mother might like some. I might like what? A voice said, and there was their mother standing in the doorway. Cocoa, Charles Wallace said. Would you like a liverwurst and cream cheese sandwich? I'll be happy to make you one. That would be lovely, Mrs. Murray said, but I can make it myself if you're busy. No trouble at all. Charles Wallace slid down from his chair and trotted over to the refrigerator, his pajamaed feet patting softly as a kitten's. How about you, Meg? He asked. A sandwich? Yes, please, she said, but not liverwurst. Do we have any tomatoes? Charles Wallace peered into the crisper. One. All right if I use it on Meg, Mother? To what better use it could be put? Mrs. Murray smiled. But not so loud, please, Charles. That is, unless you want the twins to be downstairs, too. Let's be exclusive, Charles Wallace said. That's my new word for the day. Impressive, isn't it? Prodigious, Mrs. Murray said. Meg, come let me look at that bruise. Meg knelt at her mother's feet. The warmth and light of the kitchen had relaxed her so that her attic fears were gone. The cocoa steamed fragrantly in the saucepan. Geraniums bloomed on the window sills, and there was a bouquet of tiny yellow chrysanthemums in the center of the table. The curtains, red with a blue and green geometrical pattern, were drawn and seemed to reflect their cheerfulness throughout the room. The furnace purred like a great sleepy animal. The lights glowed with a steady radiance outside, alone in the dark. The wind still battered against the house, but the angry power that had frightened Meg while she was alone in the attic was subdued by the familiar comfort of the kitchen. Underneath Mrs. Murray's chair, Fortinbras let out a contented sigh. Mrs. Murray gently touched Meg's bruised cheek. Meg looked up at her mother, half in loving admiration, half in sullen resentment. It was not an advantage to have a mother who was a scientist and a beauty as well. Mrs. Murray's flaming red hair, creamy skin, and violet eyes with dark lashes seemed even more spectacular in comparison with Meg's outrageous plainness. Meg's hair had been passable as long as she wore it in tidily in braids. When she went into high school, it was cut, and now she and her mother struggled with putting it up, but one side would come out curly and the other straight, so that she looked even plainer than before. You know you don't know the meaning of moderation, do you, my darling? Mrs. Murray asked. A happy medium is something I wonder if you'll ever learn. That's a nasty bruise the Henderson boy gave you. By the way, shortly after you'd gone to bed, his mother called up to complain about how badly you'd hurt him. I told her that since he's a year older and at least 25 pounds heavier than you are, I thought I was the one who ought to be doing the complaining. but she seemed to think it was all your fault." "I suppose that depends on how you look at it," Meg said. "Usually, no matter what happens, people think it's my fault, even if I have nothing to do with it at all. But I'm sorry I tried to fight him. It's just been an awful week, and I'm full of bad feeling." Mrs. Murray stroked Meg's shaggy hair. "Do you know why?" "I hate being an oddball," Meg said. "It's hard on Sandy and Denny's, too. I don't know if they're really like everyone else or if they're just able to pretend they are. I try to pretend, but it isn't any help." "You are much too straightforward to be able to pretend to be what you aren't," Mrs. Murray said. "I'm sorry, Meglet. Maybe if Father were here, he could help you, but I don't think I could do anything till you've managed to plow through some more time. Then things will be easier for you. But that isn't much help right now, is it? Maybe if I weren't so repulsive looking, maybe if I were pretty like you." "Mother's not a bit pretty. She's beautiful," Charles Wallace announced, slicing liverwurst. "Therefore, I bet she was awful at your age." "How right you are," Mrs. Murray said. "Just give yourself time, Meg." "Lettuce on your sandwich, Mother?" Charles Wallace asked. "No, thanks." He cut the sandwich into sections, put it on a plate, and set in front of his mother. "Yours will be along in just a minute. Meg, I think I'll talk to Mrs. Whatsit about you." "Who's Mrs. Whatsit?" Meg asked. "I think I want to be exclusive about her for a while," Charles Wallace said. "Onion salt?" "Yes, please." "What's Mrs. Whatsit stand for?" Mrs. Murray asked. "That's her name," Charles Wallace answered. "You know that old shingled house back in the woods, and the kids won't go near because they say it's haunted? That's where they live." "They?" "Mrs. Whatsit and her two friends. I was out with Fortinbras a couple of days ago. You and the twins were at school. Meg. We liked to walk in the woods, and suddenly he took off after a squirrel, and I took off after him, and we ended up by the haunted house. So I met them by accident, as you might say." "But nobody lives there," Meg said. "Mrs. Whatsit and her friends do. They're very enjoyable." "Why didn't you tell me about it before?" Mrs. Murray asked. "And you know you're not supposed to go off our property without permission, Charles." "I know," Charles said. "That's one reason I didn't tell you. I just rushed off after Fortinbras without thinking, and then I decided, well, I'd better save them for an emergency anyhow." A fresh gust of wind took the house and shook it, and suddenly the rain began to lash against the windows. "I don't think I like this wind," Meg said nervously. "We'll lose some shingles off the roof, that's certain," Mrs. Murray said. "But this house has stood for almost 200 years, and I think it will last a little longer. Meg, there's been a high wind up on this hill." "But this is a hurricane," Meg wailed. "The radio kept saying it was a hurricane." "It's October," Mrs. Murray told her. "There have been storms in October before." As Charles Wallace gave Meg her sandwich, Fortinbras came out from under the table. He gave a long, low growl, and they could see the dark fur slowly rising on his back. Meg felt her own skin prickle. "What's wrong?" she asked anxiously. Fortinbras stared at the door that opened into Mrs. Murray's laboratory, which was in the old stone dairy right off the kitchen. Beyond the lab, a pantry led outdoors, though Mrs. Murray had done her best to train the family to come into the house through the garage door or the front door and not through her lab. But it was the lab door and not the garage door toward which Fortinbras was growling.